Welcome to this session with artist Jonas Staal and the human rights lawyer Jan Fermon, who we will meet later via video message. Thanks for being with us, Jonas.
Pleasure.
I followed your work for quite some time, and what can I say? I really admire the way in which your work mobilizes art circuits and other political forms, often in new kinds of assemblies. And we just had a good time together in the Zoom waiting room. And I don't know, sometimes the Zoom waiting room is like the kitchen party. It's like where the really nice things happen. So it's a real pleasure to also meet you finally. So today you are with us to present your latest project, Collectivize Facebook, that you have developed with human rights lawyer Jan Fermon, who we will hear later via video message, as I already said. And after the presentation, we will share a couple of questions from the Telegram group. So I do invite all of you in the group to send questions throughout the session, and I will try to relay them to Jonas in the end. And I think with that, I will hand over to you, Jonas.
Thank you, Julien. I'm going to share my screen with you in the meantime. Thank you for the introduction. It was indeed, the Zoom waiting room is the best alternative for a kitchen talk at this moment. I enjoyed it very much as well. And thanks to everyone for organizing the festival and for inviting me. The title of the presentation that I want to share with you is Stateless Parliaments, Utopian Training Camps, and Collectivizing Facebook. Collectivizing Facebook being the main focus of this short presentation. I want to respond quite directly to a question that is central to this part of the program of Driving the Human, namely who has access to knowledge and participation. That has been an important question for me as well throughout my artistic work, although I would like to reformulate the question a little bit into who has the access to the means of production of knowledge and participation, and how can artistic practice contribute to reclaiming and redistributing these means of production of knowledge and participation. Now, I engaged these questions very directly in the realm of political representation in the context of my artistic and political organization, New World Summit, which I founded in 2012, and consists of various members from the field of art, architecture, design, progressive diplomacy, and law. And with the New World Summit, we try to create alternative parliaments, temporary parliaments for stateless and blacklisted political organization. And that started as a direct response against the ongoing war on terror that uses designated lists of terrorist organizations to enforce limits to access democratic institutions. So let's make it very concrete. Being placed on a blacklist, being placed on the designated lists of terrorist organizations, it means one's passport is revoked, travel ban is imposed, bank assets are frozen. Essentially, one is declared stateless, which is a kind of double negation because many organizations placed on so-called terrorist blacklists are already stateless. If we think, for example, of the Kurdish Revolutionary Movement or the government of West Papua in exile, and here you see some examples of struggles for autonomy and self-determination of groups who have faced blacklisting in a similar way and that we have worked with throughout the years. More importantly, the dominant narrative of the war on terror, that the so-called terrorist is driven by some kind of pure hatred against enlightened Western democracy, is fundamentally wrong for more and less obvious reasons. Many blacklisted organizations stem from long-standing anti-colonial liberational struggles and rather represent ideas of democracy that are too democratic for capitalist democracy to bear. When it comes, for example, to questions of fundamental redistributions of wealth, colonial reparations, these are fundamental issues that capitalist democracy is not capable of computing or of responding to in a structural way. So over the years, we developed various chapters of the New World Summit to challenge this dominant narrative, this us versus them dichotomy that was central to the war on terror. Asking the question, is it possible that we, as politicized citizens of states that are waging the war on terror, have more in common with organizations prosecuted in the war on terror than with the criminal states that claim to speak and act in our name? So in a way, we also have tried to redefine this notion of terrorism, not applying necessarily to blacklisted organizations, or certainly not exceptionally, but more importantly, to the terrorist actions of nation states in the context implicated in the context of the war on terror. In other words, the different morphologies, the visual, spatial, and performative spaces of our alternative parliaments, and I showed you a few examples in the meantime, they became a space to recompose what constitutes, what defines us in this us versus them dichotomy. And you will note that in that process, we put a lot of emphasis, a lot of investment in how different geometrical and spatial configurations of these alternative parliaments also contribute to a different appearance, a different manifestation of collectivity, and a collective exploration of new shared narratives to break this dominant storyline of the war on terror, this dominant us versus them dichotomy. Now, the most recent chapter of the New World Summit was commissioned by the Democratic Self-Administration of North Syria, better known as Rojava, means west, refers to the western part of Kurdistan. It's an autonomous region in the northern part of Syria, where an alliance of Kurds, Arabs, and Assyrian peoples have developed a model that they refer to as stateless democracy, a model that essentially tries to separate the practice of democracy from the structure of what they consider the patriarchal, nationalist, and capitalist identity form of the modern nation state. So instead of applying centralized political systems, stateless democracy in this region, in the Rojava region, is based on local communal self-governance with a strong emphasis on gender equality. And the public parliament that we were commissioned to make, a parliament as a public space in collaboration with the autonomous government, was inspired by this model of stateless democracy. And it translates visually, morphologically, into a parliament. It's literally a public parliament. It's not separated from the public domain, but it co-constitutes the public domain. The center of power remains empty, and instead the spatial emphasis lies on collective self-representation of the local communes gathered in the space. So to return to the central theme of this part of the program, in the process of developing the New World Summit since 2012, we moved in a way from challenging the means of production of knowledge and participation in the context of the war on terror to trying to create, in direct collaboration with liberational political movements like the one in Rojava, new infrastructures of collective presence. It's less about means of participation in terms of representation. It's more about creating spaces where it becomes possible to reclaim a collective presence on one's own terms, on one's own self-determined terms. An attempt to contribute to an idea of a new stateless internationalism, you could say as well. Now, in the case of the New World Summit, challenging the means of production to knowledge and participation, it takes the form of the Stateless Parliament. In a recent ongoing project titled Training for the Future, that I developed together with dramaturg and curator Florian Malzacher, it takes the form of a utopian training camp. A kind of neo-constructivist training camp that you see here, that we developed in the former industrial remnants of the Ruhr area, and a camp that we created at a time in which we collectively face various intersecting political, economic, and environmental crises, a time essentially in which the very idea of the future, or the very possibility of a future history, is structurally and systematically being undone. The future is being dismantled. And here, in a way, we gathered in these remnants, these ruins of a future past, an industrial future that promised us victory over nature, but that essentially has become represents the very extractive modes of production that have undone the very possibility of a meaningful future, a meaningful form of future survival. In this training camp, for a period of 3 days, at least in the most recent chapter, the second chapter in 2019 of Training for the Future camp, we gathered for a period of 3 days, trained 10 hours a day with 20 trainers consisting of futurologists, progressive hackers, extraterritorial activists, transnationalists, art activists, training 450 trainees focused on reclaiming the means of production of the future, reclaiming the means of production of the future in a time of dystopian normativity, in which imagining a future that in any form or way is better would be a progression from our current predicament seems impossible or unimaginable. So that included trainings, for example, in intimacy encryption by Heath Bunting to develop intimate knowledge amongst fellow activists that can be used as an alternative code to resist interrogation. So it essentially approaches the idea of encryption not in the kind of digital sense as we tend to use the term, but really encryption in terms of my profound knowledge of you allows us to have a set of references that no one else knows or understands. And even in a severe situation as that of an interrogation, we can use this intimate knowledge of each other to communicate and pass messages to one another. Another example, training by the ISD, the Initiative Structure mentioned in Deutschland, together with Global EV, in developing new common decolonized historiographies to dismantle ingrained racialized narratives and values, creating new common timelines, and of course, engaging or recomposing past historiographies is also inherently part of enabling the possibility of alternative futurities. Here you see an example of a training by the Army of Love that focuses on redistributing intimacy and love, even with those who we feel no particular personal connection or desire for. So it's a training that also critiques the lack of engagement from the history of socialist movements with redistribution of love, always focused on more material conditions, but not on these intimate conditions of redistribution. If we decommodify objects and products, could we also decommodify our very intimate relations between one another? Example of a training by the Kurdish women's movement that uses Augusta Boal's methodology known as the theater of the oppressed to dismantle patriarchal mentalities and behaviors. In their words, the training was aimed to kill the dominant male, the kind of dominant male mentality, as well as more physically engaged oriented trainings here, one by Public Movement in exploring choreographies of state violence. So to understand, take temporarily the position of states in relationship to protests or uprisings, to understand the gaze of the state in relationship to the activist, while other trainings focused on developing alternative forms of protest choreographies, thinking more from the thinking of mass protest or mass mobilization, popular movements as something that embodies a choreography in and of itself, or that can be considered as a form of choreography, has its own dramaturgy in the way that it's trying to collectively pre-enact or embody or visualize alternative futurities. So in this context, in the context of the utopian training camp of Training for the Future, challenging the means of production of knowledge and participation is embodied in what seems this very hierarchical terminology, trainer and trainee. But an effective training or a successful training essentially turns a trainee in a potential trainer, because there's a transfer of an embodied knowledge from one person to another, or from one person to a temporary collective of trainees. And as such, it's a way of spreading, redistributing tools and methods of producing alternative futurities across new communities and constituents. At the end of the training camp, a trainee is essentially, or could essentially, become a trainer. Now, these two examples, the stateless parliaments of the New World Summit, the utopian training camp in Training for the Future, these are direct responses to the aggressions and failures of existing institutional structures. The failures of the war on terror when it comes to guaranteeing fundamental principles of democratic participation and a right to representation, a right to presence, even. The failure even of our existing cultural institutions to be able to reclaim the very idea of the future as something that we can collectively engage and reclaim our stakes in. They are examples, the examples I just gave, to try to engage the field of art to develop alternative infrastructures. But there's, of course, I realized in the process also a risk in responding to crisis always by intensive attempts to create new infrastructures. Because simultaneously, it seems we seem to be at a moment where it's also essential to wage a struggle for common infrastructures that have been taken from us, or infrastructures that were never common but should have been common from the start, or because of our engagement with them. I'll try to make that a bit more concrete in relationship to the collective action lawsuit Collectivize Facebook that I developed together with human rights lawyer Jan Fermon. Was commissioned by HAU, Hebel am Ufer Theater in Berlin. And the lawsuit that we've been working on in the past 1.5 years will be submitted at the United Nations Human Rights United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva in September 2021. So the central part of this work is the indictment. The indictment we drafted against Facebook, in which we argue that Facebook infringes upon the right to self-determination of peoples and individuals in various ways. To give you a very quick overview of where this argumentation comes from, Facebook instrumentalizes users as neo-feudal data workers. Our data, our effective labor as data workers essentially constitutes Facebook's profit model, even though we are not remunerated for it, except maybe through having simply access to the platform, even though the term access could be challenged in and of itself. Facebook is obviously used in various surveillance capacities that infringe upon privacy and further impacts democratic elections in disproportionate ways. And data capture targeted campaigns of companies like Cambridge Analytica have been a recent, more known example. And the corporation has willfully advised authoritarian regimes, such as that of Duterte in the Philippines. And Jan Fermon will elaborate in a bit on these arguments in more detail. For now, I think it's important to emphasize that the core of our overall argument relates to the very structure of ownership of Facebook. Our argument is that the very ownership model of Facebook is what essentially undermines our individual and collective right to self-determination, and thus our capacity to shape our own fate. And Jan will elaborate in a moment why this emphasis on the right to self-determination and which has been or is a foundation of the Charter of the United Nations. Therefore, our demand is to have Facebook recognized as a public domain. This is the first demand that we bring forth with our indictment. And the second is the demand for a consequential transfer of its ownership to the 2.5 billion active Facebook users active on the platform today. As unpaid data workers, we worked for Facebook and now we must own it. It's time to socialize social media. Now, to clarify, to collectivize Facebook does not mean to reform Facebook or to nationalize Facebook. Our aim is to turn trillion-dollar companies into new models of transnational cooperatives, collectively owned and collectively governed by their users. This is a potential pathway to create transnational unions that go beyond the corporation and beyond the model of the nation state. In the months ahead, Jan Fermon and I will organize various pre-trials to introduce our indictment and invite publics to join our case as co-claimants, but also to invite witnesses to witness the future that becomes possible if we win the case. So we do not ask witnesses to reaffirm the argumentation that we developed in the indictment. We ask witnesses to witness the future that becomes possible when we have proven victorious. And witnessing the future is an essential part of our case because while our indictment aims to provide a model to reclaim common ownership over trillion-dollar companies, not only Facebook, but also Bayer or Alphabet, Apple, and Amazon, that still leaves open the question how we would govern these infrastructures, these trillion-dollar companies collectively as transnational cooperatives. What would be the decision-making structures, the social contract for 2.5 billion co-owners of Facebook, rather than simply being users of Facebook? Do we ensure encryption, ban algorithms? Do we decentralize servers? Or do we even dismantle the entire infrastructure of Facebook as a whole, considering its heavy reliance on extractivist industries? But before we go into that more speculative, essential, but more speculative component of the lawsuit, let's first look at the legal pathway that lawyer Jan Fermon has developed in order to be able to submit this first indictment against Facebook to the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva in the first place. So in case you would like to read along with Jan, who will be elaborating on the indictment in a moment, I would like to ask you to go to the website collectivize.org, so collectivize.org. And when you open the website, you scroll down, you will see in the column on the left, the text, read the indictment. There's an English and there's a German version. I would like for this occasion to ask you to open the English version. And that will open a PDF which contains the full indictment that we drafted against Facebook and which Jan will be speaking about more in a second. Now, if you share the objective of this collective action lawsuit, you can join us by scrolling all the way down to the website, to the section Join as Co-Claimant. We already have thousands of co-claimants to this lawsuit. When we will file it at the council, it will not carry the names of Jan and me only. It will carry the names of all the thousands of people that have joined the lawsuit, this collective action lawsuit, because we need to make a collective case for the collectivization of Facebook. This today is our invitation to you to reclaim the means of production of knowledge and participation in the context of this particular initiative. Now, companies like Facebook, Amazon have seen their quarter numbers grow enormously in the period of the coronavirus pandemic. And that shows that essentially our crisis is their capital, their chance to expand their monopoly positions even further. So apart from creating alternatives, as I have tried to do in collaboration with many different political organizations and movements, for example, through the alternative parliaments or the training camps, we must also simultaneously reclaim what we have already worked for. What we have already worked for as unpaid data workers, we have a right to own what we ourselves have created. So for those who want to read along, I hope in the meantime you had a chance to go to collectivize.org and to have the indictment at hand. I will now hand over to human rights lawyer Jan Fermon to lead us through the indictment.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jan Fermon. I'm practicing law in Brussels in Belgium. I was asked by Jonas Staal to draft an indictment for violation of fundamental rights by Facebook, a giant monopolistic player in the new data economy. I will walk you through the legal argumentation from the beginning, starting with the introduction, which showcases that the data industry plays an essential role in today's economy. Data are considered as the new oil. Collecting, processing, and exchanging data has become one of the main pillars of today's economy. In part 1, on page 7 of the indictment, in the section called Facebook's monopolistic position and hegemonic ambitions for information exchange and communication, information is provided on the central role Facebook plays in this area. 2.2 daily billion users of the Facebook empire, which includes applications such as WhatsApp, Messenger, etc., receive, disseminate, or exchange information. They generate through this activity a tremendous amount of data that are subsequently mined by Facebook. This has allowed Facebook to become the 5th or 6th largest private company in the world. Facebook has a profound impact on many aspects of our daily life. Amnesty International describes Facebook as unavoidable for most of the world population, especially the youth. In part 2, on page 10 of the indictment, in the section entitled Facebook and the Potential for Influencing or Manipulating Political Choices, we documented a never-seen capacity to influence public opinion, to promote or censor ideas, to influence elections. Facebook has the ability to steer social movements either by promoting them or by curbing them. And Facebook does not hesitate to work with authoritarian regimes. A clear example is the Duterte presidency in the Philippines. The Cambridge Analytica scandal shows that the data collected by Facebook can be siphoned by obscure alt-right structures to spread their toxic agenda of hatred and division. We take note of the fact that Mark Zuckerberg solemnly declares that this has happened against the will of Facebook and will be avoided in the future. However, we also know that Zuckerberg or his successors might change their minds overnight if the prospect of the profit rate is high enough. Here is another parallel with the corona crisis. In a column published on the US media Truthout, Noam Chomsky argues that the corona crisis can either lead societies collapsing into authoritarianism or alternatively to rethink the problems of capitalist society and develop new forms of democratic, economic, political and social systems. Many governments are imposing severe restrictions to certain civil liberties, arguing that such restrictions are necessary in the fight against the coronavirus. While certain limitations, for example to the freedom to circulate and to meet with others, can be understood in times of corona crisis, extreme vigilance is necessary to make sure that such limitations will not be perpetuated once the health risk is over. Control over data plays an essential role in the risk for authoritarianism. That is illustrated by the extreme example of the Israeli program, which of course in the name of the fight against the coronavirus allows the Shin Bet, a secret service, to use the location data of mobile phones to determine the whereabouts of each and every citizen. In part 3 of the indictment on page 19, the influence of Facebook on labor relations is discussed. Facebook has invented a new form of forced labor, with some striking similarities with servitude under feudalism. Through their activity, Facebook users unintentionally create the raw material. Facebook takes possession of these resources and processes them. The new oil is taken away for free from those who produce it. Since we are in a position of dependency towards Facebook, we are mechanically led to generate data for the algorithm, as we just need to connect, talk with our friends or post a photo. In short, we are forced to provide Facebook with an activity that does have value. Thousands of pages have been written about the risk of Facebook for the right to privacy. Most court cases conducted until now throughout the world have concentrated on this issue. Of course, we deal with the question of privacy in part 4 on page 24 of the indictment. We think the general awareness of how deep Facebook penetrates our privacy is still very insufficient. On the pages 24 and 25 of the indictment, we explain, for example, the mechanism used by Facebook to build so-called shadow profiles, in which very detailed information is collected about Facebook users who did not accept to share their contacts with Facebook. By combining information provided by others who did accept, Facebook knows as much about you as if you gave the authorization yourself. In the indictment, we refer to some spectacular examples of how Facebook has reconstructed some of the most intimate episodes of the private life of its users. There is thus a global and severe underestimation of the peril posed by Facebook to the right to privacy. But there is, on the other hand, at least some consciousness about it. That is one of the reasons we concentrate in the indictment on other and less known aspects of the peril posed by Facebook to fundamental rights, whether it be people's rights or human rights, individual or collective rights. The international covenants on civil and political rights on one hand, and on economic, social and cultural rights on the other hand, were both adopted by the United Nations General Assembly on the 16th of December 1966. In their common Article 1, they state that people have the right to self-determination, that is, the right to freely determine their political status, pursue freely their economic, social and cultural goals. The text says, I quote, "All peoples may, for their own ends, freely dispose of their natural wealth and resources, without prejudice to any obligations arising out of international economic cooperation based upon the principles of mutual benefit and international law. In no case a people may be deprived of its own means of subsistence." End of quote. Peoples must be able to decide their own fate and future in order to exercise their right to development. Control over the new oil data is decisive for the question how we can build in the future a world economy that protects the majority based on solidarity and cooperation. but it is also important for the immediate questions arising from the corona crisis. How jobs can be saved, how incomes and savings can be protected, and how new medicines and vaccines produced and made available to all. How can this be achieved if the essential raw material of the new data-based economy is under the control of a few private-owned monopolies? This is the red thread of our indictment, drafted, of course, before the corona crisis broke out. Our conclusion in part 5 of the indictment on page 28 was and remains that in order to protect people's rights and human rights, the data giants need to be under a probably new and to be invented form of public control and ownership. The right to self-determination, the right of every people to control the levers that allow to choose freely their future, is the mother of all rights. Control over resources is essential to assure an economy that guarantees the right to work, to housing, to healthcare, to access to culture for all. Control over information and channels to receive and disseminate information is absolutely essential to build a real democratic society, to fight the development of anti-democratic alt-right agendas. As said, data play an essential role in these questions. That is why we concentrated in the indictment on the menace posed by Facebook to the right of people to choose freely their destiny. We argue that it is impossible for states and even for international organizations such as the European Union to effectively control giant private interests such as Facebook by regulating some of its activities. Only full democratic public control and ownership can make structures as Facebook to be powerful instruments for human development and emancipation. We are aware of the challenges ahead. National courts, no more than governments or institutions such as the EU, can impose such public control over Facebook. National courts can at most impose some restrictions on the most outrageous excesses committed or made possible by Facebook. And we also know that in a global market-based economy, where the principle of private ownership of production means is sacrosanct, controlling transnational corporations is anyhow extremely difficult or impossible. That is why we turn with our indictment to the United Nations Human Rights Council, which has been designated by the international community as the guarantor of the rights enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the 2 subsequent international covenants. We certainly do not have blind confidence in the Human Rights Council. Therefore, we will submit our complaint to this body, but we will not give it out of our hands. We demand that the Human Rights Council includes our indictment in their agenda and adopts our argumentation to recognize Facebook as a public domain and subsequently recognizes the need for users' ownership over the platform. Further, this argumentation will need to be structurally applied to other monopolies as well, whether this regards Alphabet, the parent company of Google, Microsoft, or Amazon. But we are also aware that only a protracted social movement throughout the world will create conditions in which states and international bodies will effectively act. Our aim with this indictment is to contribute to these 2 lines of struggle, the legal struggle on one hand and the social one on the other.
Hi, thanks for the great presentation, Jonas, and for sharing that film. We have now actually quite a bit of time for questions still. And there are a couple of great questions coming through from Telegram. So one starts like this. Dear Jonas, thank you so much for your work and engagement on behalf of all of us using Facebook. For the sake of debate, I will ask this critical question. Now comes the question. Many people on Facebook are using it to disseminate conspiracy theories or even racism, discriminatory or violent content. Do we really want to collectivize a social medium, social, with them? And of course, it's a polemical question, but also serious at the same time, it says. So I guess the question is Facebook worth making into collaborative enterprise?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think it's a question, though, that relates that you could apply to any form of collective governance, or let's say any structure that is supposed to represent common interests. We can say the same about current democratic elections. Do we really want to participate in democratic elections where the alternative for Germany is spreading conspiracy theories, xenophobia, racism, together with all of its other ultra-nationalist and authoritarian fellow parties emerging across the European context and the world? I think the question is, what is the social contract based on which, in this case, you engage in the process of collectivizations? What are the checks and balances? What are the basic principles that ensure equal representation, the banning of racism, of sexism, of patriarchy? This is, of course, a huge part of the work. How do you compute in infrastructures are not neutral? How do you compute within these infrastructures themselves a possibility, or how do you compute values in the principles in these infrastructures that undermine the spreading of racist or conspiracist rhetorics? And of course, then you always get into another difficult realm, that is then who decides what is to be considered hate speech and what is not. But I think on that point we've been excessively relativist, and it's extremely important. Maybe also following the example of the Kurdish revolutionary movement, the example I gave of the autonomous government in Rojava, their social contract when it comes to gender quota for the participation of women, quota for equal representation of different minorities from the region, whether Assyrian, Arab, or Kurdish. On a very structural way, their social contract ensures that it is impossible to exclude particular voices or enforce dominant, nationalist, patriarchal forms of exclusions.
Thank you for that answer. And I think the next one kind of follows from that in an interesting way. So the question goes, yesterday we heard of John Thackeray's notions of islands of coherence. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, Jonas, but basically that's Thackeray's way of pointing out that there are sort of areas, models, and initiatives that can be found within dominant structures where alternative ways of configurations can be trialed and tested and maybe grow from there. So the question comes now. Can you say a bit more about the role of art in creating such new alternative infrastructures and how it maybe might be different from other domains? And I'm going to pull in another question that is related. Could you say something about the relationship of law and art in this last collaboration? So I guess, what is the role of art in making these kinds of new alternatives, and how do you collaborate with other kinds of knowledge forms and political forms in the process?
Yeah, thank you. Also great questions. I think when it comes to the role of art in developing alternative political infrastructures, as I tend to do, I think the importance, I think art and politics are very closely connected, that our conception of art and the validation of art, also even the funding of art and the infrastructures of art, there's always a political relation, whether that is to private money or to the role of governments. You can't really separate the two, but it doesn't mean that they are the same. And I think artistic competence relates very strongly to imaginative competence. So a capability, or at least a space that we can use or engage to push the possibility of what organizations could be beyond specific constraints of the present. So I think that the spaces that I or we, because many of them emerge from collaborations, try to create, whether it's the parliaments or the training camp or the collective action lawsuits, they are attempts to be with one foot in the real and one foot in the possible. Mm-hmm. The real, of course, of the collectivized Facebook trial is the indictment that Jan and me worked on for a year to develop the kind of the precedent and the strategy of the legal strategy of our approach. And then the speculative component, the possible, relates to the way that we try to engage with this notion of witnessing the future. Imagining that being able to place ourselves in the position of saying, we have won the trial. Now, what does it mean to collectively govern, to translate these infrastructures, trillion-dollar companies into transnational models of transnational cooperatives? And so for me, this is where the role of art plays is crucial, or artistic imagination is crucial to somehow push that one step further of possibility and to create spaces where you're with one foot in that possible reality, to kind of agitate and mobilize the desire to make it real, to bring it closer to the reality that we are presently occupying. When it comes to the relationship between law and art, Jan is working with Jan is a very interesting experience, because Jan is what is known as a progressive lawyer, but he will be the first to say that that's in itself a contradiction. He would argue that law by definition is conservative, that it is about trying to remain a particular normative conception of reality, and that the paradoxical role of a progressive lawyer is to find new ways of interpreting, to actually unleash possibilities through law, for which the law itself was meant to never make happen. So the history of law, of European law, certainly has everything to do with the protection of private property. So essentially, our demand to transfer ownership of Facebook seems fundamentally against the very reason why we have a system that we understand as a system of law in the first place. But then in history, throughout history, particularly that Article 1 of the UN Charter that Jan elaborated on in his presentation, the right to self-determination, that is a law that came in the process of the anti-colonial struggle, the right to self-determine one's own fate, one's own structure of governance. It's very different from this kind of regime of human rights, which is much more about replicating a particular generic liberal or capitalist democratic idea of society with international monitoring to make sure that free trade agreements and the role of the World Bank are all, that these accesses are all smooth. So he's also trying to find entry points in the history of the law, unexpected principles of law like that of self-determination that can somehow subvert the very interests that the law was meant to preserve. And in that sense, I see something in his way of approaching law in creating this space of possibility through rereading, subverting, hacking in some sense, an existing legal infrastructure. I see a lot of links with the way that I approach my own artistic practice.
Thanks, Jonas. Unfortunately, we already have to draw to a close. There is one more question that is, I think, quite great. I'm just going to try to make that question into a bridge to the next session, because I think in some ways that will also answer the question. So, because after this, we're closing this whole session with our last performance by Vivian Tauchmann's performance series Self as Other Training, Household. And I thought that the notion of intimate encryption that you mentioned earlier actually speaks in really interesting ways to Vivian's performance series, you know, and the way that her work really forces us to decrypt in a way and take on different kinds of intimacy. And I think that's also something that happens in your work in a different way. You work with these kind of political structures that don't immediately evoke embodiment, but then, as you wonderfully explained in your presentation, the body is, and working with the body and intimacy, it's a really interesting, important part of that work. And with that, I would like to thank you for your presentation and for your important work. And Moritz, could you take us to Vivian?
Thanks for having me.